Close your eyes. It is 1360, and you have just woken up as the most powerful man in England who is not the king. You are a duke. Outside your window, 1,000 acres of your own land roll to the horizon. In the courtyard, 50 servants are already moving. The cook wants 300 partridges for tonight's banquet. The stable master needs money for new horses. The mason who is building your new tower wants to be paid, and he is standing in the hall with a piece of parchment that lists every stone. You smile. This is the life. Then your steward slides a heavy ledger across the table, opens it, and clears his throat. And you realize that being a duke is not a reward. It is a job. And like every job, it comes with a salary, a budget, and a very long list of bills. Today, we're going to open that ledger. We are going to count every penny that came in and every penny that went out, and we're going to find out the one thing that history books rarely mention: whether the richest man in medieval England actually had any money left at the end of the year. First, let us understand what a duke actually owned. The word itself sounds enormous, and it was. But here is the catch that surprises everyone. The duke did not really own his land. In medieval England, all land belonged to the king. The king gave it out to his great lords in exchange for loyalty, for advice, and most of all for service. The duke held his land. He managed it. He collected the income from it. But the land itself was a loan, not a gift, and the price of that loan was eternal duty. The king could take it back, and sometimes he did. So the first thing our duke owns is not land. He owns a promise, and a very expensive one. The duchy itself was built from hundreds of pieces scattered across dozens of English counties. It included entire manors, which were self-contained villages with their own fields, their own mills, and their own workers. It included forests where only the duke could hunt, and where every pig that fed on acorns paid him a fee of a few pence called pannage. It included lakes and fish ponds stocked with pike and eels, because fish was food and food was money. It included windmills and watermills grinding corn for every family around. It included market towns where every stall paid him a toll. It included rivers, and it included whole flocks of sheep, thousands of them, because in the 1300s wool was the most valuable thing England produced. Some idea of the scale: a single manor, with its fields and its tenants, could be bought outright for roughly 100 to 300 pounds. So a duke holding well over 100 manors was sitting on a fortune in real estate alone, before a single harvest came in. And the wool from his own flocks, shipped to the cloth makers of Flanders, could sell for hundreds of pounds in a single year. By the middle of the century, the richest duchy of all, the one held by the Dukes of Lancaster, was pulling in somewhere in the neighborhood of 12,000 pounds a year. To understand what that number means, you first have to learn the money system, because it is nothing like ours. 1 pound was worth 240 silver pennies. 12 pennies made a shilling, and 20 shillings made a pound. That is the whole system. A penny was a real silver coin weighing about as much as a small paperclip. And when a gold coin called the noble appeared in the middle of the century, it was worth 6 shillings and 8 pence, a third of a pound, and it was a fortune. So when we say 12,000 pounds a year, we mean almost 3 million silver pennies arriving every single year. The king himself collected about 30,000 pounds in a good year. A wealthy knight of the lowest rank of the nobility, a thatched roof over 100 acres, was expected to live off a knight's fee, a piece of land worth 20 pounds a year. So our duke, with his 12,000, was not simply rich. He was running one of the biggest businesses in the entire country. And like every big business, his first problem was this: where does the money actually come from? The answer is everywhere, and that is the point. A duchy was never one giant farm. It was a portfolio of thousands of small income streams, each one tiny and each one collected by somebody else. Start with rent. The duke's land was farmed by tenants, ordinary families who held strips of land in exchange for payments. A tenant with a decent holding of about 30 acres owed the duke a money rent of a few shillings a year, and on top of that, he owed labor. During the busiest weeks of plowing and harvest, the tenant and his family had to work on the duke's own fields, sometimes 2 or 3 days a week, unpaid. If you want the true price of that labor, the account books tell us a day of plowing service was valued at about 2 pennies, the same as hiring a laborer. Next came the mills. In a medieval village, you did not choose where to grind your grain. The law said you had to use the lord's mill, and the lord took his cut, usually 1/16 or 1/20 of your grain. It does not sound like much until you remember that every family in every village paid it, every week forever. Then came the markets. Every market town charged tolls on almost everything sold. A stall in a market cost a few pence a week. A cart of goods crossing the Duke's Bridge paid a toll. A flock of sheep driven through his town paid a penny or two per head. The Duke even charged merchants to use his own weights and measures. Then came the courts. The Duke held his own courts, and justice in the Middle Ages was a source of income. A man who broke the rules of the village could be fined a few pennies for a small offense or several shillings for a serious one, and those fines went straight into the Duke's pocket. Nor was it only grain and rent. Timber from the Duke's forests, felled and floated downriver, sold by the cartload. The fish from his ponds went to the kitchens of half the county. And when a manor's livestock was cold, the beef, mutton, and hides went to market like any merchant's goods. The Duke was a landlord, a banker, and a wholesaler all at once. Add it all together, and you get the secret of medieval wealth. Nobody paid the Duke very much, but everybody paid him something. Now we get to the part people ask most about, the salaries. And this is where the medieval economy becomes wonderfully concrete, because everything had its price, and almost everybody worked for wages. Let us start at the bottom. An unskilled laborer, a man who dug ditches or carried stone, earned about 1 penny a day in the early 1300s, and 2 pence if he brought his own bread. A skilled craftsman, a carpenter or a mason, earned about 3 pence a day. The best paid workers were the harvesters, who could pull in 4 to 6 pence a day during the frantic weeks of August, because a spoiled harvest hurt everyone. A shepherd who watched a drove of sheep was paid a few pence a week and got his keep, and the woman who milked the dairy herd earned even less, usually a penny a day, because wages followed custom, not fairness. But here is the twist that changed everything. In the late 1340s, a great epidemic swept across Europe, and suddenly there were far fewer hands to do the work. Labor became scarce, and wages exploded. A laborer who once worked for a penny could now demand 3 or 4 pence a day, and skilled men asked for 6. The government panicked and passed the Statute of Laborers in 1351, which tried to freeze wages back at the old levels, reapers at 2 or 3 pence a day. It did not really work, because when you need a roof before winter, you pay what the roofer asks. Now, let us walk up the payroll of the Duke's own household. The steward, the man who ran the whole estate for the Duke, was paid like an executive, 5 to 20 pounds a year, plus his meals, plus a house. That was more than many priests earned in a decade. Below him, each manor had a bailiff, who got £1 or 2 a year, and his board, the medieval version of a middle manager. Below the bailiff sat the reeve, a local man chosen to organize the village work, and he usually paid no rent at all in exchange for his trouble. In the kitchen, a plain servant earned a few shillings a year, but he also got his food, his clothes, and a place to sleep, and in a world where bread was half your budget. A job that fed you was a serious wage. The head cook earned more, and everyone knew the cook ate best of all. The huntsmen and the falconers, the men who fed the Duke's hawks and dogs, were paid a few shillings a year each, but they lived on the bounty of the forest as well. The chaplain, the priest who said services for the household, received about £5 a year, the standard for a parish priest. And the Duke's personal knights, the professional bodyguards and soldiers on his permanent payroll, drew £20 a year and more, plus their horses, their armor, and their livery. Above them all stood the officers of the chamber, the men who counted the silver, kept the keys to the treasury, and rode to London on the Duke's business. The keeper of the chamber could expect £5 a year and the best seat at the table. City wages were another world entirely. A master carpenter or mason working on a cathedral could earn 4 to 6 pence a day in the early 1300s, and a top London artisan up to 8 pence. But he had to supply his own tools, pay for his own food, and find work every single morning. Even the lowest clerk, the man who copied letters and receipts, was paid a few pence a day plus his keep, and a skilled scribe who could also write in Latin commanded double. The poorest figures on the whole payroll were the scullions and the water carriers, who worked from dawn to evening for a few pennies a week and considered themselves fortunate to get a daily bowl of stew. To put those salaries into modern terms, historians estimate that a penny in the 1300s had the buying power of a couple of dollars today. So a laborer's penny a day was roughly a modern hourly wage, and the steward at £10 a year was taking home a very comfortable paycheck. The Duke's own income of £12,000 a year converts to something like 5 to 20 million in modern buying power, depending on how you measure it. But hold that thought, because income and cash are not the same thing, and that difference is the heart of this story. Let us go shopping, because the prices tell the real story. Take a penny out of your pocket and see what it buys at the market. For 1 penny, you could buy a loaf of everyday bread, the kind that made up most of a working family's meals. For a quarter of a penny, on a coin called a farthing, you got a small loaf, enough for 1 meal. Eggs ran about a dozen for a penny. A plump hen cost a penny or two, a capon twice that, and a goose 3 or 4. A gallon of ale, the safe, everyday drink of the Middle Ages, cost about a penny, and a better brew went for 2. A gallon of wine, the imported luxury, cost 2 to 4 pence, and a whole barrel held 250 gallons, if you were buying in bulk for a feast. Cheese and butter were counted in pennies, about a penny a pound. A pound of beef or mutton cost half a penny, a pound of pork about the same. Candles, made of beeswax or smelly tallow, cost a penny or 2 for a pound of tallow, and 10 pence or more for fine wax. A pound of beeswax, which every household burned in the best candlesticks, cost about 10 pence. A bushel of salt, vital for keeping food through the winter, cost a shilling or 2, and a gallon of honey, the only sweetener most people ever tasted, about a shilling. A pair of simple shoes cost 4 to 6 pence, a linen shirt about the same, and a warm wool cloak 2 or 3 shillings. A plain knife cost a penny or 2, a scythe about 8 pence, an axe a few pence, and 100 nails a couple of pennies. Now move up to the bigger purchases, and the prices climb fast. A pig sold for 1 or 2 shillings. A sheep cost about a shilling, sometimes 18 pence for a fine one. A cow, the single most valuable thing most families owned, cost 8 to 12 shillings, a year's work for a laborer. A strong plow ox cost even more, around 15 shillings, because it did the work of 10 men. A cart horse went for 10 to 20 shillings. A simple tunic of wool cloth cost 1 or 2 shillings, and a warm blanket cost the same. And a thatched cottage with a garden could be rented for a few shillings a year. Now here is the medieval equivalent of buying sports car. The warhorse. A proper warhorse cost 20 to 40 pounds, sometimes more. That is not a typo. One horse could cost more than a knight's entire yearly income. And the horse never stopped costing. Shoeing all 4 hooves cost 4 to 8 pence each time, and feeding a properly fed warhorse through a winter of hay and oats ran in a whole shillings. Food for the whole manor's animals, the plow horses, the dairy cows, the 100 sheep, and a hunting pack, was one of the biggest pages in the account roll every year. A plow horse needs the same hay and oats as any other, and hay for a single horse for a winter could cost 3 or 4 shillings, a sum a farmhand had to save for weeks. A plain sword cost a few shillings. A full set of armor for a mounted soldier, complete with helmet, could run 5 to 15 pounds, the savings of years. Even cloth was expensive. England's wool, 360 pounds of it in a single sack, sold for 4 to 8 pounds, and a yard of ordinary finished cloth, dyed and fulled, cost 1 or 2 shillings, while the finest scarlet, the fabric of kings, cost 8 to 10 shillings a yard, the weekly wage of half a village. Spices were the luxury of luxuries. A pound of pepper, shipped halfway around the world, cost 2 shillings, a farmhand's whole week if he was paid properly. Saffron and ginger cost many times more. And the same account books record something else, something sobering. In an ordinary year, a working family spent more than half of everything it had on bread alone, and that bread was taxed at every step of its journey, through the mill, through the rent, through the market toll. By the time a loaf reached the table, a dozen tiny pennies and fees had already been collected for somebody above. So now understand how the medieval economy worked. A family could fill its stomach for pennies a day, but everything that made life easier, warmer, faster, or finer cost shillings and pounds, and the jump from pennies to pounds was exactly the jump from survival to wealth. And this brings us to the biggest problem of being a medieval lord, the part the fairy tales leave out. Nobility was not a lifestyle, it was a never-ending series of bills. Let us count them. First, the castle. A castle was not a home, it was a fortress, and fortresses are expensive. Building a new castle could cost hundreds of pounds, and the king's great castles, the famous ones that still draw tourists today, swallowed 20,000 pounds and more over years of construction. That was a duke's entire income for 1 or 2 years gone into stone. And every castle always kept costing money. Walls crumbled, roofs leaked would rotted. Every spring, the duke was paying carpenters, masons, and roofers just to keep his own walls from falling on his head. Second, the household. A duke did not live alone. He lived with a small army of servants, clerks, guards, and guests, often 150 people or more, and every single one of them ate, every single day. Historians estimate the daily cost of keeping a great ducal household running at 5 to 10 pounds a day, which means that in just 1 year, the duke spent several times what an entire village earned in that same year. And there was an extra catch. With a household packed up and moved to another manor, the whole caravan of eaters moved with it, and a moving household ate that estate so dry that a royal visit was seen as a kind of tax. When the king visited your castle, he was doing exactly that. Third, the feast. A grand banquet, the kind a duke threw to impress, could cost more than 100 pounds, which is what 5 working families earned in 10 whole years. And the duke could not skip it, because the feast was the medieval version of politics. Every guest was an ally or a rival, and every guest had a price. Fourth, the gifts. A duke stayed powerful by giving things away. Horses, gold rings, cloth, silver cups, and above all money. To keep one loyal knight, he paid him a retaining fee of 20 pounds a year just to stay ready at home. Fifth, the church. The duke paid for chapels, for priests, and for alms to the poor hundreds of pounds a year, because for a medieval lord, charity was the most visible insurance policy in the world. Sixth, the crown. The king was the duke's landlord, and the landlord always collected. When a title changed hands, the new duke owed the king relief, a tax traditionally fixed at 100 shillings for every knight's fee that crossed the family line. By the time the first coins were in the pocket, the king already had his hand stretched out. The king, you see, always had expenses too, and the king's expenses always trickled down. The great campaigns of the 1300s were paid for by the nobility. When the king called up his host, the duke filled his share of the ranks, and the duke paid the bills. Let us read the military payroll, because it is full of concrete numbers. An ordinary foot soldier earned 2 pence a day. A famous English longbowman earned 3 pennies a day, and a mounted archer twice that. A man-at-arms, the professional in armor, earned 6 pennies a day. A knight serving in person drew 2 shillings a day, 24 pennies, the daily wage of a dozen laborers. And before any of them ever had a single coin, the duke had already spent thousands on the horses, the armor, the wagons, and the weeks of food for the whole expedition. There was even a tax that let everyone buy their way out of fighting, called scutage. A knight who did not want to march could pay the crown 2 or 3 marks for every fee he held, a mark being 13 shillings and 4 pence, and stay at home, though his neighbors would hold it against him. And when the king needed extra money for treaties, embassies, or royal celebrations, he asked his great lords for an aid, and no one refused the king. The ruler could also call on his dukes to personally guarantee loans from the great Italian banking houses, and the bankers charged interest, always. So see how the money circle works, from the tenant, to the duke, to the soldiers, to the king, and very often at the end of the circle, to the bankers of Florence and Lucca. Now we reach the great turn of the story, where the ledger tells the truth. The Duke of Lancaster was, by every measure, the richest man in England after the king. He owned more land than a man could walk across in a month. His income was the envy of every noble in Europe. And yet, when the accounts were closed at the end of the year, the cash that actually sat in his treasury was often a shockingly small piece of those 12,000 pounds. Why? Because nearly everything was gone before it even arrived. The estate managers, the bailiffs, and the reeves took their salaries off the top. The soldiers and the household took the next slab. The king once again took his taxes. The masons took their pay. The church took its gifts. The knights their fees. And the bankers their interest. What was left was the spending money of the duke himself. And the historians who have counted the actual account rolls of the great households of the 14th century found the same pattern every time. The grander the title, the thinner the cash margin. The duke was rich like a giant corporation. It had enormous assets. It employed its own army, but the cash flow was a narrow stream, and every hand that touched it kept some of it. This is the fact that turns everything upside down. The richest man in England was, in a real sense, house poor. His wealth was tied in a land that he could not sell, in obligations that he could not reject, and in a lifestyle that he could not reduce without losing his strength. Meanwhile, a completely different kind of rich man was rising in the cities. The merchant. A merchant who traded in English could pile up a fortune in pure, spendable cash. He did not have to feed 150 people. He did not owe the king 100 shillings for every fee. He did not have to throw a 100-pound feast to keep his neighbors on his side. He just bought, sold, and kept the change. The merchant had no title and no castle, but he had the one thing the Duke secretly envied: cash in his pocket. And the Duke himself, for all his glory, very often was the one who owed the merchant money. Some of the most powerful lords in England finished their lives in debt to the tradesmen of London and the bankers of Italy. And the next holder of the title spent years slowly paying down those bills. So let us settle the final balance sheet once and for all. On the income side, our Duke collected about £12,000 a year. That is the headline, and it is true. Now watch what happens to it. Out of every £100, roughly 30 went straight into running the estates themselves. The stewards, the surveys and the work, the repairs, the losses when a roof collapsed or a harvest failed. Another quarter went to the household, the kitchens, the stable, the guards, the court, the £5 to £10 a day it took just to keep the great house breathing. The king took his reliefs, his aids, and his scutage. The church took the gifts and alms. The knights and the retainers took their fees. Add it all up, and the Duke was left with a personal income that the historians measure not in thousands of pounds but in hundreds. In a normal year, the great lord's true cash surplus was often somewhere between £100 and £500. And in a bad year, a war year, a year when the harvest failed, a year of new construction, there was no surplus at all. There was debt. So here is the answer to the question we asked in the first minute. Was the richest man in medieval England actually rich? It depends entirely on what you mean by rich. By land, by power, by how many people bowed as he walked in the room, yes. Beyond comparing. By the standard we use in the modern age, by the money in the pocket at the end of the month. The Duke of Lancaster was a man running a giant, ancient, beautiful company with a terrifyingly thin margin. He was the last person in his own kingdom who could actually afford to be himself. And that is the real price of a title. Everything you own, you owe. So the next time you see a castle or a portrait of a duke in a storybook, look for the hidden accounts. Every stone was paid for in pennies. Every feast was paid for in somebody's labor. Every title was a contract with the king, the church, the soldiers, and the bankers. And every contract had a price. The Middle Ages were not simply a world of gold and glory. They were a world of account books, exactly like our world. The only difference is that their money was silver, and the rich had to spend everything just to stay rich. If you enjoyed opening this ledger, there's a whole shelf of books waiting. Tell us in the comments which medieval budget we should open next, the king's, the church's, or the merchant's chest. And subscribe so you will not miss the next account. Because in history, as in any business, the most interesting number is always the one at the bottom of the page.